Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's book-to-show comparison for the Expanse Season 2, Episode 8, Pyre. This video is part of a series of videos where I compare the Expanse TV show to that of the novels on which it is based, pointing out the differences and giving my opinion on how well the adaptation works. So I have to start with a spoiler warning for the Expanse up to the end of Season 2. However, this video will not spoil events in the novels beyond Season 2. So if you haven't read the novels and you don't want future events in the show spoiled, then don't worry, this video will be safe from such spoilers. However, this episode in particular does seem to be inspired by some events from Book 5, which I will mention in vague terms, but since that is a book that the show hasn't covered yet, I will avoid talking about it in any detail to avoid spoilers, as it remains to be seen how the show will cover the Book 5 material. So our episode begins with introducing us to the character of Prax, who is depicted as a botanist on Ganymede, a father who lost his daughter and became a refugee after the attacks there. So first we see a dream sequence / flashback that gets all of this information across, before flashing forward to present times where he wakes up on a Belter ship full of refugees from Ganymede. He's confused as he searches for his daughter May, but then is confronted by his co-worker Doris. She explains that he was severely injured when the dome came down on them and had to be placed in a temporary coma to save his life. She also explains that the section his daughter was in was destroyed, meaning that his daughter is dead. Now, in the novels, Prax is actually introduced a bit earlier in the story, and he is in fact one of the main 4 viewpoint characters of Caliban's War. In fact, he's even introduced before Christian Avasarala is, which is a huge difference from the show. In the novels, he isn't put into an artificial coma, and in fact, he doesn't leave Ganymede. We instead see him piecing together the pieces of the broken lab with his co-worker Doris, who in the novels only appears in this one brief scene, so doesn't appear as much as she did here in the show, and a romantic relationship is not implied like it is in the show. And Prax doesn't think May is dead, and unlike the show that stated she was having a doctor's checkup at the time, in the novel she was at a daycare. So the novels depict Prax searching for May and eventually crossing through a war zone to get to the daycare, but once he's there he finds that his daughter is gone, and the teacher there claims that her mother came and got her earlier before the attacks occurred, which makes no sense to Prax because May's mother lives on Ceres. So the teacher shows Prax a picture of the woman who came and got her, and that is in fact not May's mother, but the teacher insists that the system confirmed that it was her mother. So Prax starts to freak out knowing that something's wrong. In the novels, however, we do see from May's perspective of a woman taking her from daycare earlier in the prologue, but I'll touch on that more in another video. So although I did think the novel's version was interesting, as we get to see firsthand how devastated and war-torn Ganymede became because of the attacks, and it was interesting seeing Prax go on a quest to find his daughter, unlike the show where he thinks that she's dead. I did like how the show expertly summed up all Prax's backstory very succinctly, as Prax's character in Caliban's War was generally viewed upon as the weakest part of the novel, and I tend to agree with that. So I like how the show did still include Prax in the story, but decided to shorten and summarize the story, which I think greatly improved it. These scenes in particular were excellent, as they told you all you needed to know about Prax and his current situation in a few short minutes, whereas the novels took several chapters to do so, which frankly seemed to drag. So I think it is an improvement, so I'm going to give this a +2. So we then go back to Tycho Station, where the Rocinante returns after being faked out by Dawes. They return with Yagu, who is uncooperative and resistant, as he is devoted to Dawes now. Fred roughs him up, which attracts some attention of some nearby Belters who don't approve, so Johnson just has him put into a cell. Naomi then yells at Alex, telling him that he doesn't get to tell her who she gets to kill, which is referencing the last scene of the previous episode where Alex tells her to get ready to kill those who are on Dawes' ship. Now, much like the previous episode, a lot of the Tycho Station storyline is completely off book, as the whole conflict with dolls didn't occur in the novels, and Diago was not part of the novels, so this is all new. Alex telling Naomi what to do, and then her getting mad about it, is a new aspect where nothing like this happened in the novels, as they all get along fine, and Alex would never presume to give orders to the XO. This, I suspect, was done to play up her divided loyalties to the belt, a storyline I did not like, so I'm going to give this a -2. We then see Holden with Drummer and Johnson in the command center of Tycho, where Holden insists that either Drummer sucks at her job or not everyone who works for them is on their side, which clearly implies that he thinks the latter is the case. They then receive a message from Dawes that Johnson decided to play in the command center for all to see, which in retrospect is a very bad decision, as the message says that as of Dawes saying that Johnson is well-intentioned but could never truly understand the plight of the Belters, and then he chastises Johnson for trying to keep Kotazar's secret and says that he's giving this secret to the belt. Now, first off, the conversation Holden has with Drummer and Johnson about how they may have moles working for him is actually something that takes place in the novels in Book 5, so I won't get too much into that here. Only to say that in the first 3 books of The Expanse, particularly Caliban's War, which this section of the show is covering, Fred Johnson is portrayed as essentially the president of the OPA, or the equivalent of that. It isn't implied there's any discontent amongst his crew. That is brought up much later due to the events of the next 3 novels, which, as I said, I won't get into here. And as I said, Johnson playing the message in the command center is a bad idea, as it will incite further rebellion as it gives Dawes a voice. I dare say that book Fred Johnson would never do something so naive. As for the differences between Dawes and Johnson in the novels, I think I covered this enough in previous videos, so I won't rehash any of that here again, only to emphasize once again that Dawes was a completely different character in the novels than he is here, to the point where the only thing these characters really share is the name. However, the aspect of Dawes bringing Fred into the OPA mentioned here is in fact also the case in the novels, but in the novels it's shown that Dawes looks on him more as a protege, whereas here it's implied that Dawes simply used him as a tool to get back at Earth, and now that Johnson is a threat to his power, Dawes is discarding him. As to which one I prefer, it's hard to say, because the 2 versions set up 2 totally different dynamics. Both I think work for the story dynamics that they establish in their respective series, so I'm going to give this a 0. So we go back to the freighter where Doris tries to console Prax, who doesn't like the fact that he's now a refugee. She asks him what he's going to do next, saying that there's no point in returning to Ganymede as it will take them years to rebuild. She then offers for him to come with her to Mars and start over again, and she touches his hand, implying romantic attachment to that proposal, but he pulls his hand away, obviously not ready to move on and accept his daughter's death. So I mentioned in the novels Prax never left Ganymede, so he never had to ponder returning there, and Doris was just his co-worker, nothing more. But I like this scene as it does establish how hard it is adjusting to the new situation where he basically lost everything, but he does have a friend who cares about him, offering to help, whereas in the novels he was very much alone in his quest to find May. So it's touching, so I'm going to give it a +2. So then we go back to Tycho, where Holden meets with Fred Johnson about what Kotazar was working on, where he states that Dawes didn't get any of his work, but Holden points out that now that he has Kotazar, it's just a matter of time before he finds stuff out. They then bring up that Kotazar was communicating with the protomolecule, proving that there's still more protomolecule out there. Naomi overhears this and is upset that Holden didn't tell her about this earlier, but she does come up with a way to find out where the protomolecule that Kotazar was talking to is, and Drummer helps her retrieve it. And they discover that the protomolecule is in fact on a Ganymede station. Holden wants to go there to investigate, but Fred Johnson isn't so eager. He says they should just accept that the protomolecule's out there, but Holden wants to eliminate it everywhere. So, As I already mentioned, Kutzar wasn't in the novels at this stage, so this wasn't an issue. They didn't track the source of the protomolecule to Ganymede. The second novel, Caliban's War, begins after a time jump where Holden and the Rocinante crew are a ship for hire that works exclusively for Fred Johnson, and thus Holden and his crew are effectively members of the OPA. So the novel begins with Holden hunting pirates for the OPA until he gets a call from Fred Johnson to investigate the attacks on Ganymede and find out why they occurred. So he then goes directly from being a pirate, or no, it's not being a pirate, from hunting pirates to arriving on Ganymede. They aren't shown on Tycho until after they visit Ganymede, whereas in the show they don't go to Tycho after Ganymede, so instead we see them here beforehand. And why they went there had nothing to do with the protomolecule, as they aren't aware of that connection at this stage in the novels, and instead are just doing their job of investigating what went down there for Fred. Here in the show, Fred is against it, saying that what they did with Eros didn't work well for him. Whereas in the novels, it did in fact work out very well for him, and he grabbed a bunch of power. Again, I think either way works for their respective mediums, although I will say I don't like the fact that in the show Naomi gets pissed off at Holden for not telling her about the protomolecule, but I also like that in the show Holden has more of a reason and a cause to go to Ganymede, which gives more purpose to his mission. So I'm going to call it even and give it a 0. So then we go back to the refugee ship where the captain comes in and insists that they're docked with another ship that will take all of the inners to Earth and Mars. So Doris gets up to leave, and eventually Prax comes as well, as he decides to take her up on her offer to go to Mars. So all the Earthers and Martians get in the airlock, but when Prax tries to get in with them, the captain blocks his way and refuses to let him in because he's a belter and it's for inners only. They insist that they're traveling together, but the captain refuses. He then closes the airlock, and the ship's cut thrust to go to 0G, and as Prax and Doris wave hands through the glass, all the people in the airlock are just blown out into space and killed, including Doris. The captain then tells Prax that he's lucky because he's a belter and that the inners destroyed Ganymede, so they get what they deserve. Now, as I said, in the novels, Prax never left Ganymede, and Doris was only in that one scene where they cleaned up their former lab. So obviously this scene never happened and there is no equivalent. But I absolutely loved it, as for one, it was an extremely powerful scene that was absolutely heartbreaking, and for two, it perfectly portrays the race hatred that exists between the three nation states, as we constantly see Earthers and Martians treating Belters like shit, but this makes it clear that it cuts both ways, and it also shows just how fragile life is out in the reaches of space, and what a dangerous place the universe of the Expanse is. So it was a well-earned tragedy that further explores just what a tragic figure Prax is through actions, as the show can't use words the way the novels do. So I think it's an absolutely brilliant, heart-wrenching scene, so I'm going to give this a +5. So next we see Prax arrive at Tycho Station, where he receives a relief packet from Alex, who is working relief duty. Prax then goes to the doctor there and tries to report the crime of the Belter captain who killed a bunch of people, and just simply because they were from Earth and Mars, including his good friend. But when she asks the name of the ship or the name of the captain, Prax is unable to give her the answers, so she says unfortunately there's nothing she can do about it, but she agrees it's a tragedy, but at the moment they're just too overwhelmed, and she tries to make him feel better, saying, look, you're alive, focus on that. Later we see Prax warning his daughter May as he puts a picture of her up on a sort of digital mural that's mourning all of the casualties of Ganymede. So Prax coming to Tycho Station is completely a new thing, because again, he never left Ganymede in the novels, and he thinks that May is still alive. Further, Tycho was never shown in the novels as receiving refugees from Ganymede, so that's a change done mainly for plot convenience, to be honest. But seeing Prax as a refugee and going to the doctor who's unable to help him shows just just how helpless his situation is, so I'm going to give this a +2. So next we see Holden and Naomi do some research now that they know that the protomolecule is connected to the fighting on Ganymede. They try to find someone on Ganymede with ties to Protogen, and they narrow down the search enough to find the perfect candidate who has ties to Protogen and the skills to deal with the protomolecule, and they find a man named Dr. Strickland. But his whereabouts are unknown, so they look for known associates, and they find a picture of him with Prax. And they discover that Prax is in fact right here on Tycho Station with them. So in the novels, as I said, Holden and Naomi go to Ganymede to investigate what happened there. They know nothing about the ties to the protomolecule, nothing about Dr. Strickland, nothing about Prax. But while they're there, Prax, desperate for help, just so happens to spot James Holden on Ganymede, and he recognizes who he is from the news feeds and say, oh, he's a courageous belter who helps people. So he just goes up to Holden and asks for help in finding his daughter. And not having any other reason than helping a man who needs it, Holden agrees to try to help him find his daughter. And it's all just a happy coincidence that in doing so, they stumble across a plot that involves the protomolecule. Now, I can't underemphasize how much better I think the show's version of events are. As in the novels, Prax just thinks that Holden looks cool from news feeds and is desperate for help, and Holden has no real reason to help him. As sure, his story is sad, but the place is filled with sick, dying, injured, and refugees without a real home anymore. I hate to say it, it may sound callous, but Holden could throw a rock and hit 3 people with stories just as sad as Prax's. Also, it's just a coincidence that Prax's story just so happens to lead them to the protomolecule. I think it makes so much more sense that Holden puts the pieces together and ties Prax to the protomolecule first, and that's why he seeks them out in the first place. So I'm going to give this a +4. So Holden and Naomi go looking for Prax, and the doctor points them in his direction, but he sees this and assumes that it's regarding his complaint about the Belter captain killing people, so he runs, and Holden and Naomi catch up to him, and they have to grab him and threaten him, say if he doesn't stop resisting, he'll get hurt. He then promises not to tell anyone, but instead Holden asks him about Dr. Strickland, which puzzles him, as he simply answers that Strickland is his daughter's pediatrician. He then reaches for something in his pocket that Naomi finds and pulls it out, and it seems to be like a sample cylinder. So they open it expecting to find a protomolecule, but instead it's simply a plant, and he clarifies that he's just a botanist. He then tells them that when fighting broke out on Ganymede, his daughter May was with Dr. Strickland at an appointment when the dome crashed at that location. Naomi then consults with Holden, telling him that Prax clearly has nothing to do with the protomolecule, and Holden says that the connection to Strickland isn't him, it's his daughter. They then ask Prax to hook up to the client's monitoring system and look and try to find the last moments of his daughter. And they see Dr. Strickland taking May out of the clinic an hour before the fighting broke out. So indicating that his daughter may in fact still be alive, but also that Strickland knew that the fighting was about to break out. Prax can tell that they're going to go to Ganymede to look for Dr. Strickland, so asks to come with him, or with them. So in the novels, May was at daycare when the fighting broke out. As I mentioned, Prax did find out that the woman claiming to be her mother took her from the daycare, but he didn't find out Strickland was involved until much later, until they went to the chicken man with access to the security feeds. But in the show, that scene doesn't happen until the next episode, so I'll cover it then. And as I said, Naomi and Holden never suspected him of being involved with the protomolecule. However, when they discover that Strickland took May and all the other kids with genetic disorders just hours before the fighting broke out, it raised a lot of questions. Even though they had hadn't found the protomolecule connection yet, it alerted them to the fact that something was going on with Dr. Strickland. But as I said, that doesn't happen until later in the story. Again, the show's version eliminates the serendipity of their investigation just so happening to be tied with the protomolecule and gives them a reason to help Prax and to want to go to Ganymede, so I'm going to give this a +2. So next we get a scene on the Rosinante where Alex confronts Amos for not helping in the relief effort, and his only excuse is he doesn't feel like it. Now, on the screen we see Amos is hesitating on whether or not to search for a woman named Lydia who lives in Baltimore. Who she is and what her connection is to Amos is explained in Book 5 and possibly the noveletta The Churn, but I haven't read that one, so I couldn't say. But since they don't get into her story until Book 5, I won't touch on that here. So Alex then gives Amos a big speech about how they all need to help one another, so Amos asks why he abandoned his family on Mars. Alex shoves Amos, thinking that was a low blow, but Amos then shoves back really hard and threatens to do serious damage to him until Alex yells at him to stop. Amos then stops himself and collects himself and asks Alex not to push him because he doesn't want to hurt him, because then there'd be no one left to fly the ship. So this whole Amos being distraught storyline carries over from the previous episode that had the whole thing with Amos in disarray because some kid yelled at him. I don't like that storyline, and I don't think it's any better here, even though they name-dropped Lydia. Amos and Alex never had a conflict like this, and in the novels, although Amos was certainly violent, but he was never depicted as a psychopath as he seems to be depicted here, so I'm going to give this a -2. So then we then get a plot of a group of rogue OPAs, agents associated with the violent splinter group Black Sky, with the help of one of Fred Johnson's men who works in the operations center. They infiltrate the command center, killing a few people and taking Fred Johnson and his men hostage. They try to steal the missiles so they can fire them at Earth, which Johnson points out that Earth would just retaliate by destroying Tycho Station, but they don't care. They ask Johnson for the codes to release the missiles, but he refuses to give it to them. They then ask Drummer, who also refuses to give it to them, so they shoot her in the gut. She's still alive, but the Black Skies man says if Johnson gives him the code, then her life could still be saved, and because he'll let her see a doctor. But Alex and Amos find out about this takeover, and with Holden's help, they shut down the air in the command center, knocking everyone out. Everyone in there unconscious. So Holden and the others simply come in and sort out the terrorists, tie their hands, handcuff them, lock them up, and assist those who need medical assistance. Alex helps Drummer and helps carry her to the medical bay as she can barely move, but turns out she was just exaggerating her injuries as she uses it as a diversion to grab Alex's gun and uses it to kill the Black Sky leader along with the Tycho Station traitor, and then walks to sickbay on her own. Now, there's nothing really like this that happens in Book 2. However, there are a series of events that occur in Book 5 that are very similar to this, which these scenes appear to be based on. But as I said, I won't be going into any detail about the Book 5 material here. It still remains to be seen whether or not they will still do a version of this material once they do cover Book 5, or if this is it. This is the only version of those events we get. And this portion will be, once they get to the Book 5 material, this portion will be left out entirely of the show. Still remains to be seen. I did like these scenes, though, particularly the part with Drummer killing the two guys. It really helped establish how much of a badass she is, and it also lets Holden shine. So it was kind of smart to spice things up here, so I'm going to give this a +1. We then get a scene with Naomi and Holden on the Rosinante where Holden confesses that he was going to kill Kotazar, and when this upsets her, he asks her how it's any different than when Miller killed Dresden, which she supported, and she said that the difference is that it's him and that he's not a killer. Holden then apologizes and says that he needs her support and for her to remind him who he is. Now, although this specific scene didn't occur in the novels, as Holden never attempted to kill Balthazar, it does capture the essence of what occurred with Holden and Naomi in the novels, as he was going off all half-cocked on Ganymede, and Naomi needed to keep reminding him that he's behaving more like Miller than the Holden that she knows and loves, and this reminder did help ground him. So the spirit of it was the same, and I thought this was a clever way to bring this into the show, so I want to give this a +2. Alex then alerts Holden that Fred Johnson isn't releasing the docking clamps on their ship, so Holden calls Johnson. Johnson doesn't want Holden to leave as he needs his help there, and Holden says that if they do find the protomolecule, he certainly isn't going to give it to him. So Johnson claims that with all the repairs that he's put into the ship and all the aids that he's given him, the ship is practically more his than it is Holden. And if Holden leaves, he will no longer be welcomed on Tycho, and he will get no more repairs, no more free food, no more safe harbor. And Holden retorts by saying he doesn't think that Johnson will still be in command of Tycho when he gets back, and that he's basically that Fred Johnson's irrelevant now, so Johnson lets him leave. So in the novels, as I said, Johnson is the one who sent Holden to Ganymede as a full employee of his, and Johnson and Holden had a good working relationship at this stage. The falling out comes into play after Holden returns from Ganymede, because when Holden discovers there is some protomolecule on Ganymede, he assumes it must have come from Fred Johnson, as he is the only one with a known sample of it. As I mentioned before in the novels, Holden had already given his protomolecule sample to Fred Johnson in Book 1, and since a much longer time frame had passed with no sign of any more protomolecule anywhere, he had assumed that the one Fred Johnson had was the only one. So when Holden returns to Tycho after coming from Ganymede, he marches into Fred's office, angrily demanding to know if it was him. Johnson, to put it very mildly, doesn't take too kindly to these wild accusations, and so fires Holden from his service, but then states explicitly in a way that Holden believes him that it was not him. So that's how they had a falling out. And I must say, this makes a ton more sense, because even before I read the novels, this scene in the show made absolutely no sense to me and felt really out of place that Johnson would all of a sudden threaten to cut ties with Holden over what appeared to be a very weak reason. And this is coming right after Holden saved his life and the life of his colleagues, so it doesn't make any sense in my opinion, and it just feels really jarring and out of place, so I'm going to give it a -5. So my final adaptation score for Pyre is a +11. A pretty decent episode that introduced Prax very well and nicely further sets up the Rocinante's quest to Ganymede. Some things were handled much better than they were in the books, and some things were handled much worse. But overall, a net positive and a good step forward, so a decent episode. So that's it for my book-to-show comparison for The Expanse Season 2, Episode 8. I'll return in about 3 weeks for my book-to-show coverage of Season 2, Episode 9. In the meantime, you can check out my channel as I do more videos on The Expanse, as well as covering many other shows like Star Trek, Game of Thrones, Lost, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.